Tonight's encounter comes to you from long ago. We're pulling this one out of the vault. Dear Nance, I have a long story to tell you. I can say that now. I mean, about how long it is. I just finished writing it, and I went back through to proofread it, so I know this got to be a very long email. I'm going to apologize up front to all those people who like stories that get straight to the Bigfoot. I understand. I get impatient listening to stories too. But in this one, I think getting a little sense of the events that led up to the Bigfoot and getting a sense of who this involves is important to the story. Otherwise, I could just say, my brother-in-law saw a Bigfoot, liked to take them food. I saw one once, and we could call this story done. Well, that's not much fun, is it? And it doesn't really tell you the story. I spent a lot of time bringing up many memories and emotions that I had not experienced in a very long time, some of which I had not touched upon in my memory in decades. But as I unpacked all of my memories, I found more and more that I had forgotten, and I dove more deeply into those memories from decades ago. I will be 65 years old this summer, and to touch on these feelings and memories from so long ago, well, it's been incredibly powerful. Some of them are very sad for me, but mostly they are warm and bright memories of the crazy and wonderful family that I married into. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you have some patience, please, I request that you stay seated for the entire performance. All right, everyone, curtains up. Here we go. When I was at Ohio University, I met and fell in love with the girl that would become my wife. Her name was Tabitha, and believe you me, she was as bewitching as her name sounds. A few months after we had been dating came the inevitable, "I'd like you to meet my family" moment. At this point, she had met my parents when they came to Athens to visit me, and now it would be my turn to meet her family. Only we were going to stay the weekend with them at their house not far from Marietta, Ohio. In the back of my head, I kept hearing my father's stern voice, who many times had said to me, "You don't just marry the girl. You marry the family too, so choose wisely, son." I think he was speaking from his own experience, as my mother's family, shall we say, had some very shady characters. This was in 1982, and while the world was slowly changing, it had not changed enough that I had any expectation of staying in the same room as Tabitha that weekend. Today, no one bats an eye at some college-age couples and sometimes even high school sweethearts shacking up together in the same room at family functions. But take yourself back to 1982. It was a very different world. If you lived in it, you know what I mean. Think about it. Ronald Reagan was in the White House. Princess Diana was still young and had just given birth to Prince William. The first streaks of punk rock were rippling into the United States from across the ocean from the UK. Walter Cronkite was still on the evening news, and societal notions of what was and was not acceptable never included sleeping in the same room as your girlfriend in her parents' house. In short, society, at least in Ohio, especially rural Ohio, was still very conservative. As we drove from Athens to her parents' home located in a rural, hilly township just beyond Marietta, Tabitha went over once again all the do's and don'ts when I got to her family's house, and alerted me to all the peculiarities of each family member and what to expect that weekend in general. All of her requests and instructions seemed quite normal, until she dropped a large, what I call, kook bomb on me. A kook bomb was my code word ever since 1982 for all the weird things that I would eventually discover about her family. And believe me, I discovered more than a few. Even long after we were married, she would start to tell me this or that about some person in her family, and I would stop her and say, wait, are you going to drop a kook bomb on me?" To which she would usually playfully smack my arm giggle, and then proceed to finish telling me all the latest news about whoever she had started telling me. Now, that also means it was almost always a kook bomb that she dropped on me. But the biggest kook bomb that she ever dropped on me in the 38 years that I was under her spell was the one she dropped on me that day as we drove toward her family's home. I remember I was driving that little 1976 Datsun wagon that my parents had bought used for me to take to university. My father was in the Air Force, and they were stationed at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base near Dayton, Ohio. And before they handed me the keys to that little wagon, I had to promise to call home every week at the very minimum. And I had to promise to drive home at least one weekend every month during the school year. And it turned out that was the sole reason they bought that car for me. They didn't want me to have a reason not to come home. And for the record, I believe I kept my word on both of those requests. Early on in our relationship, Tabitha had told me that she had a younger brother named Jamie who had Down syndrome. Again, take yourself back to 1982. It was a very different world, and not everyone was kind about Jamie or his condition. There were people who avoided Tabitha completely once they learned her brother had Down syndrome. Now see, today we see people with Down syndrome out and about in society quite often. But in 1982, that was rare. Most Down children, at least in most of Ohio that I knew of, well, they typically did not go home with their parents from the hospital after they were born. It's a sad, terrible thing to mention, but it was the way things were. As a result, it was less common to see Down syndrome's children in everyday life. I still remember Cicely, that was Tabitha's mother, crying as she told me about the very day that Jamie was born. She was holding little Jamie for the first time. She was still reeling from giving birth, dealing with afterbirth, and a well-meaning nurse leaned into Cicely and said, quote, "You know you don't have to take him home. There are places better suited to handle a mongoloid child." Unquote. Cicely said that was the word she used, the nurse, a mongoloid. Cicely was horrified. That was her baby, and she was taking him home, and she would raise him to the best of her ability no matter what, and no one was going to stop her. And heaven help you if you called her child a name like a mongoloid, or if you used that other word, the R word. And the thing is, those were acceptable words way back then. But Cicely was ahead of her time, and she would have none of it. Again, 1982. It was a different world for sure. I tell you these things not to shock you or to upset you, but to tell you truthfully about the nature of the people that I was about to meet. In a simple sentence, they were the kindest, most loving, honest, and most steadfast people with a strong sense of family that I've ever had the good fortune of knowing. In many ways, they were better than my own family. And even with all that kookiness, heck, maybe they were so awesome because of all the kookiness. So anyway, what was the big kook bomb that she laid on me as we drove? Well, Tabitha told me there were several Bigfoot on her family's property, and that her brother Jamie had formed a special bond with them. She thinks they had a mutual fascination, and that Jamie had actually seemed to have made friends with more than one of them. I remember looking over at Tabitha as I drove. I looked at her so long that she had to yell at me to go back to watch the road. I remember thinking, what have I gotten myself into? But it was too late to back out now. We were less than 10 miles from her family's place. I remember looking at the high ridges that were covered in heavy forest on both sides of the 2-lane road we were driving on, and I had to wonder, were those banjos I heard in the distance? "Bigfoot, huh?" I finally asked her. "Yeah," she said. "Jamie's the only one that they will come near." "Right," I said. "That makes sense." Yeah, I can't lie. The needle on my kook bomb meter was buried over into the red zone. "No, really," she said. I heard the exasperated tone in her voice. "Listen, I just don't want you to make fun of Jamie if he starts talking about it. He doesn't have a lot that he likes to talk about, but he does like to talk about them." Now, somehow, what I heard from all of that she said was, "Jamie lives in a fantasy world. Don't tear down the white picket fence that he built up around that world." So I agreed that I would not poke fun at Jamie over Bigfoot. When we got to her parents' home, I was very relieved to find the sound of no banjos, and it was indeed a lovely, normal, non-kooky home. And the people I met, well, they weren't quite as kooky as my mind had made them out to be. Well, not at first, anyway. That came later. Herb and Cicely were lovely people, and Jamie, he was an exuberant boy of 14 who both liked knowing that he had your attention and yet got shy and turned red because he knew he had your attention. I hadn't been there an hour when Jamie wanted to tell me all about his Bigfoot friends. At first I was only half listening because I already believed that this young boy was just isolated and lonely, and he had made up these friends in his head. I thought maybe he'd seen like the $6 Million Man episode with Bigfoot or something else on television, and from there decided to make up his imaginary friends. Either way, I wanted Jamie to know that I would listen to him, that what he said mattered. I had made up my mind about that long before we ever got there, after Tabitha told me about a lot of the treatment that Jamie had received over the years. But as I listened to Jamie, what caught my attention was the detail he was going into. He had names for each of them. There were 3, Fred, Wilma, and Barney. Now, those weren't unusual, I guess, and I'm sure imaginary friends usually do have names. But as he described them in such detail, including what they liked and didn't like, well, he even included the sounds they made. Talked about how Fred was grumpy, and Wilma didn't let him get near Jamie because of that. He talked about how Barney was already taller than him, but he remembered when he was smaller than him, even though Barney was younger than him, that he was taller than him. Jamie had a lot of details, and from what I understood, Barney was Fred and Wilma's son. Yes, Jamie did watch the Flintstones, and I'm sure that is where the names came from. Anyway, I asked Jamie how he met his Bigfoot friends, and he said that they had come down to talk to him one day when he was out in the yard. After that, they came down to see him sometimes, and whenever he could, he would go up to the hill and see them. I looked over at Herb and Cicely. They had heard every word of what Jamie said. To be truthful, Jamie was the first person with Down syndrome that I had ever really talked to up to that point in my life. I mean, I had seen other children with Down syndrome, but most were being raised by their elderly grandparents, and they tended to just silently follow along with their grandparents. Usually their gaze was cast down at the ground. They seemed to exist more than live. I thought that was typical for Down syndrome children, having never seen anything else. But I quickly learned how wrong that idea was. I understood that it was very important to Jamie that I not just listened to him, but that I believed him. I assured him I did. Of course, I really didn't. Not right then, anyway. That weekend I met more of Tabby's family that came over for a barbecue, and all of them seemed to indulge Jamie with his Bigfoot talk, but I don't think any of them took him seriously. I found out that this had been going on since he was about 12. I also saw that Jamie had one of those Bigfoot action figures from the $6 Million Man show, and he carried it with him everywhere. When I saw that, I thought, aha, that's it. That's how all this started. This lonely, isolated child built a whole world around this little tiny action figure. I couldn't have been more wrong. As for Herb and Cicely and what they believed and what they knew, I can tell you that I know Herb believed him. I think Cicely did too, but in a slightly different way. They were vigilant parents, and they did all they could to discourage it and to keep an eye on Jamie and to not let him outside alone. One night, Herb and I were outside talking. We were talking about it, and I said that I figured it was just something Jamie had made up because maybe he was lonely. Herb went quiet for just a second. Then very quietly he said, "Listen, I'll tell you why I believe him. Because I saw one of those things myself." You could have knocked me over with a feather. When Herb told me this, I had gotten to already know him a little bit, and I knew he wasn't the kind to tell tales. So when he told me he saw one, I listened up. He said he had been up in the woods on their little trail after some pretty intense storms had rolled through. He was looking for fallen trees or damaged trees that could be marked to take down. They were always looking to put up more firewood to season, he said. He was walking straight up the trail when he saw a dark human shape, but it was very large, and it was vectoring to intersect him from the tree line. It ended up on the trail about 25 feet ahead of him. Whether it actually meant to run into him or not, Herb said he couldn't say for sure. He had been up and down that trail and over to the other side of that ridge probably 1,000 times in the 20-plus years they had lived there, and he had never seen anything like what he saw that day. He said the thing came to a stop on the trail, and it stared him down. This was a behemoth of a creature, he said. It looked powerful enough to rip a horse in half, never mind what it could do to a human. They had a moment of uncomfortable eye contact. Well, at least it was uncomfortable for Herb, he said. The Bigfoot seemed to be in a neutral stare, but Herb said that he felt that it could turn at any second. Herb said he didn't think twice. He started backing down the trail as quickly as he could without turning and running. He said it stood there, and it looked at him for several seconds as he retreated, before it went on to cross the side of the hill. There was something in the way Herb told me that story that made me believe every word he said. But if I believed Herb, well, didn't that mean that I should probably believe Jamie too? Now things seemed more serious, and I listened to Jamie more carefully when he talked about his Bigfoot friends. Herb also told me that they spent a lot of time making sure Jamie did not wander up into the trees on the hill, as he seemed to always be trying to do. But like any determined child, Jamie did manage to elude his parents more than once, and immediately he would make a beeline up the hill into the trees. When Jamie was not successful at eluding his parents, he would stand at the back fence of their yard and yell up into the hillside. Cicely had caught Jamie making sandwiches one time and throwing them as far as he could into the trees. When asked, Jamie said that he had promised his friends some food. Nothing Herb or Cicely did or said could make Jamie stop this behavior. One day Cicely said she indulged Jamie and pretended to be happy to help him make some sandwiches for his friends. She used this as an opportunity to get him to open up about these so-called friends. Cicely was still of half a mind that Jamie was being taken in by some cruel teenagers or someone else asking for food. Now, this was before Herb saw one himself, by the way. So Cicely casually asks him about his friends. Jamie said that Wilma was very hungry all the time now because Fred took all of the food, and now she had a baby in her stomach, and she wanted more food for the baby. Cicely said she was stunned. She had never really discussed the concept of pregnancy with Jamie, although she was pretty sure he was aware of it. Still, it was a surprise when he inserted that kind of detail about one of his Bigfoot friends. "How do you know she's got a baby in her stomach?" Cicely asked him. Jamie said because she was getting fat, and all she wanted was to eat food. And one time she touched her belly, then opened and closed her mouth several times. Somehow, to Jamie, a light bulb went off in his head, and he made the connection that she was pregnant with a baby in her stomach. After that, the sandwich making was out of control. Cicely found food missing all the time at alarming rates, though she could never find out exactly when Jamie was going missing. She was already keeping a very close eye on Jamie, and as autumn became winter, Well, he was outside less and less, to her relief. So where was the food going? She asked Jamie finally, and finally he told her. He said that Wilma was coming right up to the house, right up to his window at night. He was giving her food from the window. Stunned, Cicely looked into his room to discover that the screed had indeed been removed from the window and was on the floor leaning against the wall. This alarmed Cicely greatly. She told Herb, and they decided that from then on, at night, Jamie would sleep in the guest room on the front side of the house next to their bedroom. But after a few nights, Cicely became concerned again and insisted that they move a single bed into their own bedroom, so Jamie slept in their room at night. She had a fear that no matter where he was going to open windows at night. After waking up and he wasn't in that single bed more than once, they opted to install a home security system that would set off an alarm if a window was opened. Jamie was not happy about that. Well, Herb had already seen one at a distance. Cicely had a very different sighting of what was probably one of the Bigfoots, but she didn't recognize it as such at the time. One day, Jamie was outside on his swing set. The phone rang in the kitchen, and Cicely stepped inside to answer it. From there, she stood in front of the kitchen sink, where she could look out the window into the backyard and watch Jamie. Only Jamie wasn't at the swing set anymore. Alarmed, she ran out to see Jamie at the far side of the yard at the fence line. He was animatedly talking loudly, almost at a yell, towards something in the trees on the hill. Those trees started about 125 to 150 feet away from the fence, according to my best guess from memory. Cicely looked up to see who he was talking to, but all she saw was a dark and hairy animal that she initially took to be a bear standing on its hind legs. As soon as she saw it, she said it dropped back to all four paws. Scared that a bear was about to run down and come over the fence, she grabbed Jamie by the arm and dragged him back to the house. She told me more about that day, but the important thing here was that Jamie was talking to what Cicely believed were bears. However, if you asked Cicely about this, even after Jamie identified his friends as being Bigfoot, she would say it was absolutely a bear she had seen that day. Herb did not seem to think so. Jamie sure did not agree with that, and from the way it was all described, I don't think those were bears either. Cicely was more vigilant whenever Jamie was outside, but this behavior did not stop. Jamie would go to the fence line and yell to the trees whenever he was outside. She never heard an answer, she said, but this behavior unnerved her nonetheless, and no matter how she or Herb tried, they could not get Jamie to stop. Jamie just called his friends big, hairy people to begin with. He didn't know the word for Bigfoot, I guess. It wasn't until he saw the $6 million man action Bigfoot toy at a church rummage sale down in Marietta. Then he grabbed it off the table and excitedly told Cicely this was what his friends in the trees looked like. Like this, Mom, this. Now, if you've ever seen the $6 million man version of Bigfoot, you know it really does look more human than Bigfoot-like. It looks more like a curly-haired man with just a lot of hair. I've included a picture that I found on the internet of the toy and a photo from the $6 Million Man show. You can see what he really looked like there. And you can see it looks more human in every way, doesn't it? Not at all as we think of a real Bigfoot. And just think, that is the best that costumers in Hollywood could cobble together with all of their vast expertise and a big costume budget in 1977. And that's why I believe the Patterson-Gimlin film shot 10 years earlier is the real deal. But that's another topic. Cicely bought that action figure for him that day because Jamie would not stop until she did. It became Jamie's prized possession. It still was his most prized possession when he passed away from a heart condition at the age of 31. But let's not go there yet. Let's go back to 1982 when Jamie was still an exuberant 14-year-old who was a long way off from that final day. Despite their best efforts, Herb and Cicely caught Jamie at the fence many more times, and to their horror, they once discovered that Jamie had gone over the fence and was long gone in the trees for hours one afternoon. You see, children with Down syndrome are kind of like children for their entire lives, and many retain the impulses of, say, a 3 or 4-year-old. Jamie was one of those. It didn't matter how many times you told him no or explained why. If he wanted to do something, he would do it. Jamie had trouble understanding consequences, and more importantly, understanding that danger could be ahead. Of course, that was part of what made Jamie so incredibly wonderful to be around. He had no cynicism, and he still saw the world as some wonderful place full of beautiful, blooming possibilities, and his curiosity was incredible. But those traits also could spell disaster for him at any moment, as any parent listening can well understand. But getting back to that weekend that I met her family, it was one big kook bomb after another all weekend. But the truth was, I really did like them all, especially Jamie. He was so excited to have someone new to talk to and to tell stories to, someone that was actually listening and talking back to him. He said he wanted me to meet his friends one day, and I said, "Sure, I'd like that." I said that, not believing for 1 second that there were any Bigfoot up there in those trees behind the house. It was a good, if overwhelming, weekend, and when we left, I said to myself, "Yeah, I could marry this girl and her family. Yeah, they're kooks, but they're the good kind of kooks. I can live with that." That thought came like a thunderbolt out of the blue from nowhere as we were driving toward Athens early one morning heading back to university. I looked over at Tabitha, sleeping in the passenger seat, and I knew it was true. I could marry her and her family. I was stunned because I had never thought in such a way before. Now fast forward 2 years, and I had spent many more weekends at her parents' house. When we both graduated in 1984, we got married that summer, right there at her parents' house. When we were planning the wedding, Jamie asked to be my wingman. I thought he meant my best man. But after talking, I understood that his slight speech impediment made it sound like wingman, but he was trying to say ring man. He wanted to carry the ring. He wanted to be the ring bearer. Of course he could be my wingman, ring man. Jamie took his duty, by the way, of being my wingman, ring man very seriously. He stared holes at that ring as he carried it on that pillow. You would have thought he was guarding the Hope Diamond. Jamie carrying that ring down the aisle that we made in the backyard had all the gravity of Queen Elizabeth II's procession entering Parliament. It's still one of my favorite moments from our wedding. In 1986, we welcomed our first child. Jamie, well, he was thrilled as bright punch when he first saw our little Charlotte, our daughter. But then he got sad and he said that Wilma didn't get to have her baby. Of course, I knew who Wilma was, or who he meant, but I was not aware of the Wilma/baby in the stomach situation previously as he had told Cicely. So I was a little perplexed that he brought up such a strange and sad tale at that time. But Jamie told me that a while back, Wilma was supposed to have a baby, but something happened, and she was suddenly not fat anymore, but there was no baby there either, and she seemed very sad. Then he tells me that he hadn't seen Barney in such a long time. Barney was now gone too. Now what supposedly happened, or really happened with those two stories in reality, I do not know. But they were upsetting enough that they affected Jamie for a very long time. Later, I found out the initial story that he had told Cicely, and then I told Cicely what he had told me. Seems he never told Cicely the other part of the missing baby, or that Barney was gone. Maybe because it had all upset Cicely. Now, these things went on for years. Jamie talking about Fred, Wilma, and Barney, or then talking about Barney's absence. And he talked about them as if they were real, everyday things going on, the way we give updates on family to each other. As for our part, it was hard to believe what Jamie was saying, but we were wary enough not to discount it. If Herb hadn't already seen one, and if Cicely hadn't seen a supposed bear that day, I think we all would have completely discounted all of Jamie's stories. I know this email has become all about Jamie. Maybe it's because I'm missing him so much lately. I lost Tabitha 2 years ago to COVID. That was quite unexpected. In 1993, Herb had a series of heart attacks and passed away. In 1997, Cicely's kidneys finally gave out from uncontrolled diabetes that had raged for more than 2 decades in her. That left Jamie alone. So we took him to live with us. We loved him, and he loved us, and he loved our children, his cousins, and all of them, and us. We treated him like gold. But the light was now gone from Jamie. He had lost his whole world, his parents, and his Bigfoot friends. I don't know who Jamie cried more bitter tears over. In 1999, Jamie's heart finally gave out. Like many Down syndrome children, he had been born with a congenital heart defect. And although he had had corrective surgery in the first few weeks of his life, his days were numbered. And whatever that number was, we all knew it was probably going to be much lower than most of ours. But it was still a great shock when it happened. To the very last day, Jamie insisted his Bigfoot friends were real. Do I believe it? Yes, I do. I did see one, you see, and I will get to that. But even before that, there were days when Jamie would disappear for a whole afternoon, and one time for most of the whole day. We were all very frantic, and we had already contacted the authorities who were on the scene talking to us, when Jamie casually came strolling down from the woods on the hill behind the house. He reeked of a pungent smell that's very difficult to describe. He said it was because Wilma hugged him to keep Fred from being mean to him. Fred, it seemed, did not like Jamie being too close to Wilma or Barney. And though Fred was bigger, it seemed Wilma ruled the roost, and Fred didn't cross her too very much. Jamie told so many stories of the afternoons spent with his Bigfoot friends on the hill. I wish I had really listened to him and remembered each and every one. But honestly, most of them were very similar. He would take them food. He would call out to them. He would go into the trees and wait. If they showed up, he would talk with them for a while, and they would eat the food that he gave them. And he said that Fred usually took most of the food right away, and he didn't always share. Jamie also told me that one time he tried to give some food to Fred, and he tried to hold some back to give to Wilma and Barney when Fred went away. But Fred was smart, and he knew that Jamie had more food. He pushed Jamie down and took the bag of food from him. Then Wilma became mad, and there was a shoving match between Wilma and Fred that ended with Fred taking all the food and running because Wilma began to chase him with a big stick. After a minute or two, Wilma came back to where Jamie was, and she made sure that Jamie was okay. He said what he really loved were the times that she would run the back of her hand down his face, and she would make strange throat noises while looking at him. It was clear Jamie had no fear of Wilma or Barney. But Fred was another story. He said that sometimes Fred wasn't actually mean, but he let Jamie know that he didn't like him and didn't like him being around. I asked Jamie one time what would happen if he went up on the hill and he met Fred without Wilma there. "Oh," Jamie said, "that's happened." I said, "What happened?" He said nothing. Fred would just stare at him, make some noises, but he would just walk away. Another story he told was of Fred starting to hit Barney. It started a year or so before Barney finally disappeared. He said it wasn't a fist that he hit Barney with. Jamie mimicked the action and took his whole arm and brought it up to the side of my head, with his forearm making contact with my ear on the side of my head. He said Fred would reach up and swing with his whole arm and catch Barney's head like that. I asked him why was he hitting Barney. Jamie said he didn't know. But then the day came that he never saw Barney again. He assumed it was because of Fred. And that was when Jamie really began to understand that Fred might be dangerous. He once whispered to me, even though we were in the house. He had to whisper it, like he was afraid his friends would hear. But he told me that he thought Fred killed Barney, and that Fred killed the baby that Wilma didn't have. Now, where he got those ideas, I don't know. I asked him if he saw anything other than Fred hitting Barney, and he said no. I asked him why he thought Fred had killed Barney and the baby. Jamie just looked at me and shook his head. He said, I don't know, but I know that he did. I know he did it. He then said that Wilma kept trying to make Fred go away, but he wouldn't go away. After Barney was gone and Wilma had no baby, that, Jamie said, is when Wilma really started getting close to him sometimes and would touch him and hug him. Keep in mind that most of these details Jamie did not tell us at the time. If he had, I don't know what my in-laws would have done. Up until their dying days, they mostly believed that Jamie must have seen a Bigfoot in the distance, like Herb had. And at some point, maybe he saw the $6 Million Man episode with Bigfoot or some other thing on television, and everything else sprung up from that. At the same time, they worked hard to keep an eye on Jamie, which could be difficult, so that told me, despite what they said, they had to have believed him. Now, there's a lot more information out there today on this subject than there was back then. I think Herb and Cicely were just overwhelmed and unsure of what to do. Their only concern was keeping Jamie happy and safe, and they were very proactive in keeping him off the hill. They had once discussed moving at one point, mostly because by then Herb's health was beginning to go downhill. But all talk of moving stopped when Jamie had a meltdown that lasted for days and was like any other his parents had ever witnessed. Jamie would not hear of moving. He would not leave his Bigfoot friends. During the short time that Jamie lived with us, he seemed to spend his days in a half-dream state, reliving the times with his Bigfoot friends. I knew Jamie was lonely. I knew he was unhappy living with us in Pittsburgh. But what could I do? That was where our jobs were. That's where our children were enrolled in schools. That's where we had a home with a mortgage. We could not move back to Ohio. And as far as I knew, there were no Bigfoot families rolling around in Pittsburgh. Now, do I believe the things that Jamie said? Yes, I do. I absolutely do. You see, even if I hadn't seen one myself, which I will tell you about soon enough, I would still believe what Jamie said. I can't explain it. It defies all rationale and logic. It sounds absurd. But here's the thing. Jamie never once wavered in his recounting of his interactions with the Bigfoots. Not once. Now stop and consider that Jamie couldn't always remember the order of the letters in his own name to write it out, but he never forgot a single detail about his Bigfoot friends. And I'm not down-talking Jamie when I say he did not have the mental acuity to recreate and retain stories the way we do, not imaginary ones anyway. Now, real memories, real things that happened in real life, he could replay those in detail for you a decade later, down to what we were talking about as we drove somewhere, and sometimes he could even tell you what we were all wearing. But a story that was made up? Jamie didn't seem to have the ability to retell something like that again and again accurately. I have to make that distinction because so many people write Jamie and what he said off because he had Down syndrome, like he was a babbling idiot that didn't know what he was saying. But I can assure you, Jamie was no idiot, and he did know what he was saying. It's true, Jamie's mind worked in a curious way, quite differently sometimes than ours. But he was sharp in many ways. As I just mentioned, he could recall things that he himself had experienced in great detail. But trying to remember facts and abstract things like letters, numbers, dates, things that weren't something that he experienced as a memory, that was a bit more elusive for him. That was the difference, you see. If Jamie experienced it, it was a memory that he never forgot. If it was something that he was just supposed to remember, some fact, that was difficult for him to repeat correctly at a later time. I hope you can see that difference. The only time any of us deliberately let Jamie go into those woods on that hill was the very last day there, the day that we were closing and had to move him to Pittsburgh. Jamie understood. He could not stay there with his parents now gone, but his heartbreak was tremendous and very real. He packed a large grocery sack with a lot of the food that we bought specifically for him to give to the Bigfoots as his way of saying goodbye. As I watched him start toward the trees, I waited until he looked back one last time to make sure we weren't following him, and then I followed him just as Tabby and I had agreed upon. Agreeing to let Jamie say goodbye in his own way was the only way we could get Jamie to stop his continual meltdown in the weeks leading up to that. I knew Jamie for 17 years of his short life, and I had never seen him act like that. I heard it was pretty much the same when his parents had mentioned moving. I was armed, and I followed Jamie as stealthily as I could up that hill. I just wanted to make sure he was okay. And in truth, I was curious about whether or not these Bigfoots were real. In my mind, I half expected it was some habituated deer or maybe even some tame bear. Now that all sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? But watching my brother-in-law walk up a hill with a bag full of food for some Bigfoots was even more ridiculous, don't you think? Jamie stopped not far from the top of the hill. There was an area in a group of maples where he sat the bag down. I heard him calling out several times. I watched from a distance as he waited. Several minutes went by. Then Jamie called out again. He began to sound desperate as he called out over and over. I knew he was worried that they wouldn't come to see him. He had told me that they didn't always come. Sometimes they could be on another hill and they didn't know he was there. He was so scared that he wouldn't be able to see them one last time. He really wanted to see Wilma. I know he didn't care about Fred, but Fred was the reason I was there, and the reason I was armed. Again, if the Bigfoots were real, I felt Fred would be the threat, not Wilma, whose biggest crime had been to squish Jamie up with hugs, trying to protect him from Fred. No, I didn't think Wilma was a threat, if Wilma really existed. When no answers came back and no Bigfoot showed up, Jamie sat down and began crying pitifully. My heart broke as I listened to him. Deciding that this had gone on long enough and far enough, I took a few steps toward Jamie, and I stopped when I heard a breathy blowing sound very close to me, behind me to my left. It was like a strong hissing intake of breath. I turned my head quickly to see what I assumed was Wilma. She stood there staring at me, perhaps 20 feet away. I assume it was Wilma because of her large breasts. My mouth went dry, and 1,000 things went through my head, but through it all, I could not move. Wilma gave me a long look, and then began walking toward Jamie as he sat there on the ground crying. I couldn't believe my eyes, yet there it was, right there. It was all true. I watched breathlessly as Wilma went down to Jamie, who stopped crying when he saw her. He got up to his feet, and yet he still didn't come chest high to her. He started talking a mile a minute through all of his sniffles. I don't know how much Wilma understood, if any, but she seemed to listen to him. Then she stopped and she looked over in my direction. Jamie followed where she was looking, and he saw me. I saw surprise on his face. I called out and told Jamie that we needed to go soon. The truth was we didn't really. We still had time. But I had felt very vulnerable now out there. Now seeing the size of Wilma, who, by all accounts, according to Jamie, was much smaller than Fred, I was fearful that Fred might come along. Jamie kept saying his goodbyes over and over to Wilma. I don't know if Wilma understood the gravity of this situation. She seemed more interested in the food in the bag. To Wilma, maybe this was just another time that she happened to see Jamie. She was probably going to see him again. Maybe that's what she thought. Maybe it was best that way. As he wound up saying goodbye to her, Jamie started to edge closer, as if he wanted to hug her. She stopped him with a hard look. Jamie began to cry again. I saw Wilma reach up and touch his face with the back of her hand, just as Jamie had once described for me. I called out to Jamie again. I was really getting worried about Fred showing up now, since Jamie had said before that he seemed to zero in on the food, and he could get aggressive. Reluctantly, Jamie broke away from Wilma and came my way, crying harder and harder with every step. I got a hold of Jamie's arm, and together we walked down the hill under the very watchful eye of Wilma. I think she knew Jamie was upset, and I don't know if she thought I was the cause of it, but I thought it best to put some distance between us and her. This was very hard and emotional for Jamie, who had always had problems processing his emotions. The recent, almost back-to-back losses of his parents had left him reeling, and now being forced to say goodbye to this creature that he thought of as a friend, and possibly one of his very few friends, well, that was a terrible heartbreak for Jamie. I told Tabitha that I had seen the one that he called Wilma. She knew her dad had said he had seen one up there once before, but no one else we knew of had seen one, just Jamie. And well, now I had. I never again questioned Jamie's memories of those creatures. I let him talk about them all he wanted. But strangely, once we moved to Pittsburgh, Jamie spoke of them only rarely. In Pittsburgh, Jamie seemed to shut down. He now shuffled along with us, his head down, just as the other Down syndrome children I had seen before, the ones I had described to you earlier. He existed, but he was no longer really living. I think all the loss was too much for him, and all of it together broke the already fragile heart that he had been born with. Tabitha tucked the Bigfoot action figure into Jamie's casket before it was closed. If nothing else, Jamie had a friend with him forever. Thinking on all of this has brought up so many memories for me. Reading this back, I see it's a little bit more about Jamie than it is about Bigfoot. But I do hope there's enough Bigfoot here that you can find it usable for your videos. I wish I had written down everything Jamie told me about them. But over the years of listening to Jamie, it seemed to be the same stories over and over and over, and now they have all run together in my memory. Jamie will be gone 25 years this May. He was a special light in our lives, filled with happiness and curiosity. He saw the best in everything and everyone, even distant creatures out in the forest. Herb and Cicely had raised him to be confident and happy, and it showed in the way he handled things in life. Losing Jamie felt like Tabitha and I had lost one of our own children. I always missed Jamie, but once I lost Tabitha a few years ago, I began to miss him even more, and I cannot tell you why. I did find out, though, that after Tabitha and I were married, the entire family had been watching me that very first weekend to see how things went with Jamie. It was kind of a litmus test. If there had been one whiff of me ignoring Jamie, down-talking him, or being cruel in any way they didn't like, or anything that made Jamie feel less than welcome. Well, Tabitha told me that they would never accept me, and neither would she. You see, everything hinged that weekend on Jamie. I didn't know it. My future happy life, my future wife, my future children, and my future grandchildren, it all hinged on a young man with Down syndrome who talked to me about Bigfoot one weekend. Lucky for me, he gave me the thumbs up and said that he liked me, or who knows where I would have ended up. But luckily, I married the girl and her kooky family. I have often wondered what happened to Wilma and Fred and Barney. And I wonder about that missing Bigfoot baby. What really happened there? I wonder what Wilma thought when she never saw Jamie again. Did she make the connection to the last time she saw him and understood then why he was crying? Can they process those kinds of thoughts, emotions, and memories? I'm going to bet that they can and that they do, although I have no evidence for that. So there, that's my story. This has been a really, really long email, but it really feels good getting it all out. You know, I don't know that I've ever told anyone outside of the family this entire story from beginning to end, all in one sitting. I know this has gone back and forth. I kept reading back through and adding things, so I apologize if some things are out of order. I'll be 65 this year, and I'm just not as sharp as I used to be. But thank you for reading this all the way to the end, if you did. If you decide to use this, please don't use my name. I'm now a retired physician in the Pittsburgh area, and I still sit on more than one board. This has been a labor of love to type out in an email. I've gone back over it a couple times. Thanks for everything, as I have enjoyed hearing other people's encounters on your channel, and I just wanted to add this one to the repository that seems to be growing online. I want people to know that while there are reports of angry, dangerous, vicious Bigfoots, not all of them are like that. Some of them have a soft spot for young children. Maybe they even like young children who have something special about them, the way Jamie did. I'm going to stop for now. If I don't, I think I could keep typing all night. But all that keeps spilling out is how much I miss them all. I could go on and on about seeing that Bigfoot and tell you how it changed many things for me. But all of it pales in comparison to Jamie's broken heart. So please, just sign me, Doctor-in-Law to the Kooks.